Ya ya rai rai ra rai rai ri rai ri rai ri ra rai rai ra rai 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 ri ra nai nai na nai nai na nai 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 Ananai nai na nai na nai nai Ananai na na nai 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 Shalom, shalom, wonderful friends. Great to see you. Thank you for being here. I know our friend Gary Friedlander is volunteering in Israel right now as a doctor. Oh, Cheryl, welcome back. And great to see you all. Thank you for joining. And excited to hop in today with Emmanuel Levinas. Um, and yeah, thanks, Lauren. Maybe we'll get to Fackenheim sometime as well. Squeeze him in there. Important voice. So let's start with a little poll question here around Levinas. Why are humans capable of inflicting unbearable cruelty upon others? Why are humans capable of inflicting unbearable cruelty upon others? Is it one, because humans are fundamentally evil? Is it two, because people are capable of the dehumanization of the other? Or is it three, that ideological confusion can block basic empathy? Two and three are a little bit of a nuanced difference. One is that, well, evil, obviously, people are evil. Two is that there's a process of dehumanization. And three is that there's kind of an ideological confusion. You can come to believe something that in the name of something bigger, right, you can no longer see people in the name of that. You know, we have a small group today, but nonetheless, okay. 20% because humans are fundamentally evil, 60% because of a process of dehumanization, and 20% an ideological confusion that blocks basic empathy. Okay, so Levinas is going to offer us a great insight into this question, and not just an insight, but a pathway forward to some degree. So, why are humans often so tragically cruel to one another? What spurs us to take action in the world? What teaches us on a soul level that acts of loving kindness are necessary? Emmanuel Levinas was born in pre-World War I Lithuania, but he moved to France for his studies. During World War II, he worked as a translator for the French military, and he was taken as a German prisoner of war, which ironically benefited him because, unlike so many of his fellow Jews, he wasn't taken to a concentration camp. Levinas had a deep interest in the Talmud, but as a philosopher, he's best known for his work on the ethics of alterity, meaning the ethics of otherness. This came about because the Holocaust pushed Levinas to rethink the great problems of philosophy. He wondered, how could a society as famously enlightened as Germany's, the one that gave birth to the greatest modern philosophers, have committed the atrocities of the Shoah, of the Holocaust? His answer was that the dominant philosophy of the time had become too far removed from basic ethical concerns and emphasized abstractions that could cause us to forget our ethical responsibilities to others. Consequently, A paradigm shift in philosophical thinking was in order, Levinas said. The question of what it means to be human could not be answered through logic and the imagination, but was to be found first and foremost in the face of each person we encounter. The face is what is paramount for Levinas, not abstract ideas. When we encounter the face of another human being, Levinas believed, it should be as if we're standing at Mount Sinai, hearing God commanding us. The dimension of the divine opens forth from the human face, he writes. Let me repeat that quote. The dimension of the divine opens forth from the human face. The human face demands so much of us that we are pulled into a divinely commanded level of commitment. The proximity of God, devotion itself, is devotion to the other man. Then one need not even hear the other speak for this to take place. For the encountering of the other, we hear them communicating with us through the presence of their face. This isn't exactly the same as Levinas's fellow Jewish thinker Martin Buber's philosopher, who we already talked about. His philosophy of dialogue, right? Levinas is about the face. Buber cares about the face also, but really about dialogue, about the voice. The voice of another awakens us rather than the face of another. This is because for Buber, the encountering of the other is not so much about the political and moral implications that spring from it. From Buber's perspective, it is about understanding and recognizing the other as a person different from myself, yet nevertheless in relationship with me all the same. For Levinas, however, the encounter with the face of the other places obligations and responsibilities on us. It compels us in a way that will inevitably have both ethical and political ramifications. So let me just spell this point out a little more clearly, because I think it's important. Remember Buber's I and thou and I and it that we just talked about very recently? So for Buber, you can't, another person can't be a means to another ends. Another person is an ends in themselves. And that means for Buber, the encounter with the other has no moral or political implications. Why? Because if my encounter with you invokes some other obligation, then I've made you instrumental towards that political ends. It's a spiritual encounter, not a moral encounter for Buber. For Levinas, it's the opposite. For Levinas, my encounter with the face of you is not a spiritual encounter as much. I mean, there's a dimension of that, but it has to actually awaken me morally and politically. My encounter with you awakens me to a larger question of justice beyond just your being. So Buber takes a spiritual approach, Levinas takes a moral approach to that encounter. This, for Levinas, should not be seen as empty, feel-good rhetoric. The implication is that when somebody needs me, even if I turn away from them, I cannot escape the demands that their face puts on me. Instead, I am forced to confront the consequences of my actions. Levinas's idea here comes from the synthesis of two camps, the dialogical philosophy of Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig, and the phenomenology of Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger, four people we've talked about. The key modification being that we must go beyond the abstractions of phenomenology and ontology, right? Heidegger becomes a Nazi, right? And that's exactly Levinas's point. You could be a brilliant philosopher, and your philosopher actually leads you to become a Nazi, right? To join that party. To see why, one must look no further than Heidegger's own participation in the Nazi party. The danger of such an approach is that one loses sight of the presence of the other in the name of some grand ethic. And that is that it is they, more than any other philosophical concept, which structure my existence. So naturally, it's not hard to see the parallels between the demands of the human face identified by Levinas and the demands of the image of God in each person as expressed biblically. While for Levinas, the image of God is in the human face, in Jewish thought, it's in the person's entire being, but can be represented by the face. The face is significant for Levinas because it reflects the location of human subjectivity. In Totality and Infinity, his book, he specifically focuses on the eyes. In seeing the eyes of the other, we must confront their absolute freedom and unknowability. We know there is, quote unquote, someone there, but we will never know them fully. He was also probably influenced by Rosenzweig and the Torah, which describes revelation in terms of an encounter with God's face, right? Panim el panim, this face-to-face encounter. In Judaism, we have the idea of achzariyut, or cruelty. What specifically does cruelty entail? The medieval commentator Abraham ibn Ezra says that cruelty is to make someone like a stranger. Achzar, right? Achzar means like a stranger, and the word for cruelty is achzariyut. So how does cruelty happen? When we think of another as a stranger, right? This person is unfamiliar to me, and that itself, that unfamiliarity can lead to a strangeness, to a fear, and ultimately to a dislike or a hate because of that foreignness. And so which can lead me to, once again, those all of you who said a process of dehumanization. It makes somebody like a stranger, someone whose face and presence you don't know, right? You don't know this person, you can't know them. We negate our responsibilities to them, thereby potentially allowing us to be cruel. At the same time, we must resist the urge to fear otherness. For some, it makes sense to love other people because we can see ourselves in them. But for Levinas, this is not the case. We don't love someone because we see ourselves in them. Rather, our obligation to the other comes from the confrontation with the face, through which we experience their otherness, right? It's not sameness that brings me to like someone, but otherness. There's no great achievement in treating others well because they're just like us, right? If I treat you well because you're just like me, right? That's not some great ethical leap. As human beings, we do that naturally. Instead, it's precisely the fact that the other is not like us that puts us in relationship with an obligation to them. It's the foreignness of the other that awakens my ethical responsibility. Levinas takes the Torah's imperative that we must see ourselves as having been slaves in Egypt and develops it in the following fashion. Here's what he writes over here. The trauma I experienced as a slave in the land of Egypt constitutes my humanity itself. This immediately brings me closer to all the problems of the damned on the earth, of all those who are persecuted, as if in my suffering as a slave, I prayed in a prayer that was not yet oration, and as if this love of the stranger were already the reply given to me through my heart of flesh. My very uniqueness lies in the responsibility for the other man. I could never pass it off to another person, just as I could never have anyone take my place in death. Obedience to the Most High means precisely this impossibility of shying away. Through it, myself is unique. To be free is to do only what no one else can do in my place. To obey the Most High is to be free. I feel bad for people who don't have a narrative of oppression, because part of what Levinas is saying here, go back to the first line, the trauma I experienced as a slave in the land of Egypt constitutes my humanity itself, right? We need that historical trauma, that collective trauma, in order to, in order to constitute this human experience of seeing the other. Now, the trick here is, how do you not have an identity of victimhood? Because we know many minorities have a primary narrative and identity of victimhood, and we know the pitfalls of that. The challenge and opportunity is, how do you hold a narrative, a story of oppression and of trauma, while not letting it dominate you, so that it cultivates an empathy and a bridge building and a responsibility rather than a victimhood? And that's what Levinas is talking about here. We hold on to this consciousness of historical trauma, not to dwell on that, but in order that it makes me responsible, right? It's not entitlement. Oh, the world owes me reparations and X, Y, and Z. I should get all these things because I have this historical trauma. Not to say there's not a claim to those things, of course, but rather, yes, I have claims to my trauma, but primarily my trauma is here for me to execute responsibility, to show responsibility, right? And so for Levinas and in our justice work, whatever that may be, we must recognize that those we work beside and those we seek to help are always radically other. In order to love the stranger, we must first recognize how much of a stranger they are. Levinas is forcing us to confront the fact that the stranger isn't some holy angel that has descended from heaven who must be treated with love and care. They are instead different from me. Their wants, desires, and values may, in fact, upset me deeply. Right? If someone takes a simplistic view of people, if you look at this picture right here, you just say, oh, those are 21st century, people of color living in America, right? But if you went into some more complexity of each person, and you looked at the three people in the front who are on our staff here, you said, oh, well, Brandon, is half Black and half Native and has a whole rich story. And Eddie here, who is a migrant, and was an asylum seeker from Mexico, and Angelique, with from a biracial family. And actually, all of them there are on a Native American reservation, hours north. Those six people behind them are Native Americans from the Hopi tribe up on the Hopi reservation. They were just there a few weeks ago taking this picture where we were up there bringing them firewood and supplies. And so it's one thing to say, yeah, and proud Jew, right? And different religious and ethnic identities, and so looking at these people, it's very easy just to be like male, female, white, person of color. Actually, each person has their uniqueness. There's no identity of Asian Americans, right? There's so many different identities and different ethnicities of Asian Americans or Black Americans. There's so many. There's no predictability. We can't just slap on someone that they're predictable as a Black American or even Jewish American, right? You can be a Republican Jew and a Democrat Jew and a centrist, and you can be a Black Jew and a white Jew, right? Or a Catholic. Maybe you think what the Pope did yesterday on same-sex marriage and offering blessings is the greatest form of progress. Maybe you think he destroyed the church. Maybe you think it was insignificant. It was whatever it was, right? And so it goes on and on that we want to move away from labeling people simplistically, right? Politically, people do that because they want to build power and organize, and so they want to label people quickly. But rather, Levinas wants us to see the uniqueness of the other in their face, not just their political label, the ethnic label they're given by society, but and also not just that we're all just humanity, we're all the same, woohoo, yeah, hallelujah, and that we're all really just humanity. There's no differences. Rather, no. There's a commonality to humanity, but each of us is radically different. Each of us is radically different. We have to talk to each other and see each other to deeply understand that. And so justice work in a Levinasian sense means being open about this, something we are loath to do in the politically correct world we live in, where language becomes empty. In the Psalms, David understands God as commanding him to seek my face, it says in Psalms 27:8. Here's what David says. In your behalf, my heart says, seek my face. Oh Lord, I seek your face. What does it mean to seek God's face? Do not hide your face from me. Do not thrust aside your servant in anger. You have ever been my help. Do not forsake me. Do not abandon me. O God, my deliverer. Well, interesting enough, we might say, one more line. Though my father and mother abandon me, the Lord will take me in. Right? A lot of ink has been spilt on that last line. What does it mean, my father and mother abandoned me? Some people read that historically to say, what was David's relationship to his parents? Some people read that as just the inevitability of human experience, that eventually every child comes to feel forsaken by their parents. I mean, the common way, the most tragic way, is a parent who walks away from their child, right, at birth or some other time. But the more common type is when a child inevitably realizes that their parents cannot protect them, which every child comes to realize, that the parent is not God, the parent is not all powerful, and that's not something tragic. That's something of maturation, and that learning that really only God, at least in this theology, is the one that will not forsake us, the one who will be with us to the end. Another form of abandonment is the death of a parent, whether it happens early or late. That it's very common for a child, whether it's a young child or an adult child, to feel abandoned by the parent when they die. How could you do this to me, even if it's, wasn't suicide, or wasn't through other or it wasn't choiceful at all, or not to suggest that suicide is choiceful, of course. In any case, when David talks about seeking God's face, it may be that there is a unique face, so to speak. Right? We're very used to Maimonidean theology, which means God has no body. And that is the mainstream Jewish approach, of course, that God cannot have a body. And that's one of the differences between Christianity. Can God be manifest in the flesh? That said, that whether face is allegorical or whether face actually does mean the human face, that God is manifest through the diversity of human faces, that every man and every woman and every non-binary person and every race and ethnicity, that every face of a human being is needed collectively to ultimately see the face of God. How much is this just like a human-to-human interaction, what David's talking about? King David, in need, seeks the face of God, and he's frustrated that God seems to be hiding God's face from him. Why is that? Because in a face-to-face interaction, God would see the need to be of assistance to David, to help him in ways even his father and mother won't help him. For all of us made in the image of God, the duty is no different. This point is emphasized by Rosenzweig, a significant influence on Levinas, who explains, a man who asks cannot be disregarded. One must turn away one's eyes to reject his entreaties. As long as one meets him face to face, his request must be granted. Right? Think about somebody who sends you a piece of mail asking for $20, and how you might experience that piece of mail differently than someone laying on a street curb who begs you for $20. How differently do we experience that face-to-face encounter of someone begging us for help versus an email or a letter from somebody asking for help? We may be very skeptical of the email letter. Oh, who really is this anyways? And what do they really need? And is this a campaign? More so than the person in the street. We may also be skeptical of the person in the street, but perhaps less so because we can see their face. Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi read the face in these verses as intimately connected to the heart. He's the Baal HaTanya. In the Tanya, he did some wordplay in Hebrew, recognizing that David says, my heart said for you, seek panai, seek my face. The Alter Rebbe said this means we must seek the panimiyut, the innermost level, though the word sounds like my face, panim, of the heart. We have to seek the innermost place of the heart. Seeking the face of God is deeply connected with our own inward spiritual journey, right? It's not looking outwards, it's looking deeper within the own heart. Today, many of the great evils of the world are not perpetrated face to face. On the large scale, poverty does not occur because I in my car pass by an individual person who needs help. That's not the reason for poverty ultimately. We have systems that force millions of Americans to live without their needs met and allow billions of people to live in deep poverty in the global south. Even in our communities, we ship our unhoused neighbors to encampments, thinking we can put the needs of the other out of sight and out of mind. Factory farming is not different. We don't see the animals we eat until they're wrapped and refrigerated in the grocery store. To be sure, Levinas did not apply his ethics to animals. Similarly, but more aligned with his thinking, we put imprisoned people and the problems they face far away, so that almost none of us need to see these people who are incarcerated. Even warfare is something we can try to do Through cyber strategies, drone attacks, and distant missiles, we can degrade the other far more easily when it takes less work to turn away from their face. Right? Some of the things that the most harsh critics of the war in Gaza don't necessarily understand is that we don't need any. Israel doesn't need any ground soldiers in there. Things could all be done from a distance if you wanted to do just carpet bombing. Now, some people might feel it's already too reckless, and maybe there are some signs that it is. I mean, just the fact that what we saw about the recklessness of the 3 Israeli hostages were killed holding white flags might indicate some of the other dimensions, involved. I mean, war is hell. But just to make this point, that war could be done totally from a distance without ground troops at all, as war often is. Think about the American strategies of the wars of the last 20 years, how involved drone attacks were, whether we think that's legitimate and helpful in warfare or horrific. In any case, war used to be very much face to face. You forget even guns, swords. I mean, people fought with swords. You could literally see the person's face as you fought them, as opposed to shooting across a field or into a building. Warfare has changed even in that encounter at all. But friends, what about the Holocaust, going back, which consisted of a great deal of face-to-face killing? My gosh, I mean, if you can't handle hearing something intense right now, put on silence for 30 seconds. Let me give a pause for anybody who needs a Holocaust trigger alert. One of the I don't even know if I can go there. I'm not going to go there. You know what? We live in intense times. We can talk about intense things. It's important for us to not hide from the brutalities of the world. One of the images I can never get out of my head from the Shoah, Nazi soldiers literally taking the babies from their mothers and smashing the baby's head on the wall, and seeing how many hits it would take to kind of blow the brains out of this child in front of the mother. 3 hits was like a poor move. You want to get it in 1 hit. And I mean, stories like that only scratch the surface of what we're talking about. Levels of cruelty. And of course, levels of cruelty like that exist still today as well. But for a person to want to, smash the head of a baby against the wall in front of its mother and then go home for dinner, it's unfathomable. It's unfathomable that we live in a world where humans can see humans face to face like that, and do things like that. Yes, Lauren. What we learned on October 7th of what's capable with rape and brutality and things done to children is just remarkable. And we need to be sure that we take a stand on for any people in the world, that face such a situation, that the Jews, based not only on our religious teachings but also this history, take a stand against cruelty. But this is why I continue to believe that more than a political revolution, we need a spiritual revolution. We need it to be impossible that a whole society of people can be on board with such things happening. Anyways, in the Shoah, their ideology enforced by the hierarchy of the society was the curtain between one person and another. Here, we're not talking about revenge, as bad as revenge is, or warfare, as bad as war is. Here, we're talking about an ideology of genocide, that is a superior race and an inferior race, and you're doing something good for humanity by wiping out the inferior race, right? That's, I mean, not just racism, but racism to the extreme, where you believe that this form of racial genocide, cultural genocide, is ultimately good for humanity because you're so blinded by the ideology of what the world needs. Think back also to the desire to uproot communism from the world. As soon as there's a sense that there's an ism in the world that has to be uprooted, and anyone who stands behind that ism has basically lost the dignity of their lives. Atrocious things can happen. The ideology of progress had even low-ranking Nazis believing that it was worthwhile to wipe out the Jews and others. He describes his own experience of this during World War II. He served in the French army only to be captured and sent to a German prisoner of war camp. He describes his time there as follows. The French uniform still protected us from Hitlerian violence, but the other men, called free, who had dealings with us or gave us work or orders or even a smile, and the children and women who passed by and sometimes raised their eyes, stripped us of our human skin. We were subhuman, a gang of apes. So in some ways, what's more painful than being chained up, waiting your death, is not the soldiers doing it to you, but the quote unquote normal people walking by, just looking at you, who no longer really see you. I remember, actually, there's a famous Levinas quote that the last Kantian in Nazi Germany was this dog that in a concentration camp, in some prisoner of war camp, some dog looked at him and looked him in the eyes and saw him. And he said it was the first time, that someone not chained with him kind of saw his eyes. In the aftermath of the war, Levinas made it his life's project to remove these metaphysical barriers to seeing the other. With modern technology, we love to have the illusion of seeing the other. We look at pictures on Facebook of them. We interact distantly, though with image saturation on Zoom as we look at each other now. Are we seeing each other's faces on Zoom right now? Is this a real seeing or not a real seeing? We like to think these ways of seeing each other are no worse than doing so in person. But in fact, much of the time, we can totally miss the other. It's easy to feign the projection of presence when we're sitting in front of a camera. But in reality, we might be perusing email or social media when it looks like we're making eye contact. There's no replacement for face-to-face presence. And we would be doing ourselves a favor as a culture by trying to make face-to-face presence preferable, perhaps even required as often as possible, especially when there are ethical consequences at stake. By spending time with one another, we realize that each of us is profoundly different, yet paradoxically bearing the same image of God. The call to seek the face helps us realize the potential of others, and it helps us realize the importance of ourselves. Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Kutsk, known as the Kutzker Rebbe, memorably offered a teaching. Oh, that picture is a mistake. I'm sorry. That is a picture of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, not the Kutzker Rebbe. I don't know why he's there. I missed that. Sorry. Anyways, the Kutzker Rebbe memorably offered a teaching which is a bit confusing at first. Here's what the Kutzker Rebbe said. If I am I because I am I, and you are you because you are you, then I am I and you are you. But if I am I because you are you, and you are you because I am I, then I'm not I and you are not you. Let me read that again in case it's the first time you heard it. If I am I because I am I and you are you because you are you, then I am I and you are you. But if I am I because you are you, and you are you because I am I, then I am not I and you are not you. Rabbi Mark Asher Goodman wrote, in other words, if I am only acting this way because I'm trying to be like you, then I'm not really being myself. And maybe you're not either. To conclude, the lesson of Levinas is that we have to see others in order to help others become who they're destined to be. And through this relationality, we will live out the purposes of our own lives as well. Okay, dear friends, that was about and a big pull on the hearts as well. Yes, and thank you, Cheryl. COVID compounded the problem of not being face-to-face and seems that we can't totally return to what it was. Could not agree more. People often talk about young children who fell behind in social skills and emotional intelligence based upon those years of isolation. But the truth is it affected our whole culture and our whole society in ways that, may in some ways be irreparable. So thank you. Thank you for that. Yes. Okay, friends, I'd love to open up the conversation. Hi, Lauren.
Hi. I had a hard time deciding between 2 and 3 because they're related. I think you said they were related, right? Because you may not see the others as you, and because you were brainwashed that way. And I was listening this morning. I listen 4 days a week to, it's called ISDF. It's the Hasbara Office of Reserves in the IDF. And very interesting this morning because they were talking about, like, okay, you can get rid of Hamas and all their capabilities, but what do you do with the people who've been so brainwashed to hate you? And that's going to be, I think, almost impossible, but very, very long term. I mean, they've on both sides, right in Yehudim, Shomron, and in Gaza, they have been so brainwashed to hate Jews and to really believe that it's within their power to destroy Israel. And as Dr. mitzvah to kill Jews and to destroy Israel. So what do you do with that? How do you even begin to address that amount of not seeing the other as a human being and being brainwashed to hate them?
Yes. So thank you, Lauren, for raising that, because I think that I think there's a problem both on the left and on the right in regards to our relationship to Islam. I think the problem on the right is oftentimes a dehumanization of Muslims, a lack of interest in bridge building and partnership building, and we saw some of that in the Trump administration, with the Muslim ban and the like, which I stood against. And I think the naivete on the left is to not take fundamentalist Islam seriously. Now, of course, that is not to say anything about Islam fundamentally or about Muslims at large, but to not understand that hundreds of millions relate to and potentially support what is, in my view, a dangerous radical fundamentalist Islam is a real naivete about a threat to global stability and people who really want to destroy the West. And liberals don't like to talk about that because that sounds like you're anti-Islam or you're anti-Muslim or something like that, which it should not be. But just as I would oppose a Judaism that wanted to wipe out other groups of people or wanted, to commit genocides, or would reject forms of Christianity which wanted to convert people by sword, I also would reject forms of Islam that think the West is fundamentally evil and should be destroyed, and that Israel should be destroyed and Jews should be killed. And so I think we have to hold those both, that Muslims are human beings with full dignity, and we need to build bridges and defend their rights and do all possible to build, Muslim-Jewish relations and, to expand empathy and community and come together. I really believe in that so deeply. I've been doing Jewish-Muslim dialogue for years. And also understand that there is a very large group of people who subscribe to a form of Islam, which I think puts many people in danger. They seek to kill LGBTQ people. They seek to oppress women. They seek to turn back time on progress on various fronts. And I want those queer people and those women to know I'm their allies against that fundamentalist Islam oppression. And I think you're exactly right. And I think that we can't fall in the trap of being in one camp or the other, right? Like far left people who see Hamas as reasonable people who are on the side of Hamas, I think there's a sickness. There's a real sickness there. I saw this video recently, went viral, of a trans person marching next to a Palestinian person who was of a fundamentalist orientation. And the Palestinian person of a fundamentalist orientation learned the person was trans, and the trans person's like, hey, we're in liberation together. And the Palestinians, and then they said, what? Like, you're trans? Don't you know what the Quran says? Literally, this was caught on video. Like, don't you know what the trans says about you? Like, you should be killed. Yeah, and the person's like, what? Like, who am I marching with here? They just thought, hey, we're in the liberation camp, together. And like, actually, they have a totally different orientation to the world. And so we can't be naive about that, And I would think we have to wake up around those realities, and yet at the same time, we have to. Anyways, I think I've made the point. So, Lauren, thank you for raising that. And I think Hamas is very dangerous. That doesn't justify killing innocent civilians. We have to do everything. Israel has to do everything possible, even more, to ensure that innocent civilians aren't killed. Although it's inevitable in war, of course. And and not dehumanize, say that these lives matter, every life matters there. And yet see the evils of Hamas ideology for what they are. All right, but push back. I mean, everyone can always push back. If you see any of this differently, please, or you think I'm using any insensitive language that you want to push back on, I always appreciate that.
I thought, not having to do anything with any Judaism per se, or what we're talking about, just from the very beginning, and talking about the face and seeing the face and seeing the other. I'm in a wise aging class. And one of the things that we talk about is that when people get to be a certain age, they become invisible. I mean, we become invisible, I should say. People don't want to see us as viable members of a community, or, being able to hold to interact and everything like that. So we actually talk about that a lot. And the rabbi, this Rachel Cowan, who wrote the text that we use, talks about that as well. But that's what made me think of, sometimes people look right through you. And then, this is apart from aging. I mean, it goes to a homeless person or a disabled person, if you don't want to see a person. And so this speaks to me, this spoke directly what Levinas was saying, is that you need to see the person. You need to see the individual. You need to, and have some sort of internal empathy for someone else's situation.
Cheryl, let me ask you, why do you think that is? Why do you think it is that people of a more advanced age, can be dehumanized or seen past? Like, what is it about getting older that you think leads to that?
I don't know. I mean, we talk in our group about, we're perfectly capable of ABC and XYZ, and maybe doing it a little differently than we might have, let's say, 20 years ago or something like that. But, it's, you think of the curve, you start as a child and there's the curve. And then, at a certain stage, you go back to somewhat childlike behaviors or incapabilities or that kind of thing. I mean, my dad is 97 and a half, and I'm seeing that, in him, but I want him to be seen too. And I want him to be, recognize that he still has some, certainly mental capacity and all of that stuff. And maybe, I don't know, maybe people look upon those of us who have gotten older into as being less capable, and it might just be differently capable and then less capable.
Great, awesome, Cheryl. I'm so glad you brought this in, and I want to just reflect for a minute on what you said, and invite others who want to weigh in on the chat, or when you want to unmute yourself to as well, about this issue. And it's empirically true. I mean, the number of psychological studies that show the biases towards people who are older, the assumptions about them. And it has to do, partially it has to do with some understanding of beauty, that young is beautiful and old is not beautiful. And beauty can be trusted more. And there's something more liked about beauty. Part of it has to do with what you said about productivity, that in America, we value people because they're productive. And when you're retired, how productive can you be? And if you're not productive, what value are you, right? We have a society that values what people can contribute, what they can do. And you've lost your value when you're not a working person, when you're not producing for the society. Another idea is that older means you're backwards, right? You hold a backwards ideology. You're out of date. Millennials, we got it all right because we're on the forefront of progress. But you must be sexist with your backwards thinking and homophobic and da-da-da-da-da, right? We didn't start the fire. Your generation started the fire, right? And so but then to get into Levinas, I think that like a homeless person, An older person represents an obligation to me. Once a person has a need, a potential need, there's an obligation, and we want to shy away from obligation. I want to look away from the homeless person. I want to look away from the person, over 70, because they might be needing something from me, right? And I don't know if I want to slow down what I'm doing. So those are three or four of my thoughts on why there might be a bias, or even a dislike, or even a disgust, or even a turning away from people who get older. And I think it's a real sickness. I think it's one of the great societal ills we have in America. I'd put it in the top 10 list as to how do we kind of psychologically rewrite ourselves to see aging differently. But let me pause there to hear if others want to weigh in on that point before we move on. Or Cheryl, if you want to jump in again on that.
Well, I was just going to add one other thing, and that is that has to do with how we see ourselves versus how we see the other. And this goes right down to race and, I mean, certainly any kind of ethnicity or anything like that. If we see an other and they're not like us, it might that I just just having. I mean, just having been in Colombia, I mean, and when this, and learning all about how the Spanish came over, the white Spanish came over, and, the indigenous peoples were, wiped out or marginalized or whatever. And of course that happened in, here too, the same kind of explorers and conquerors came here too. But I think that's part of it. And if you go to like art representation, it's very funny when you see an artistic rendering of the Jews crossing the desert, and they're dressed like, 19th century Hasids. That's not how it was, but that's there's a comfort in familiarity. That's comfort and familiarity. So
great. Thanks, Cheryl. Thanks. Hi, Sarah.
Hi. Like Cheryl, I've been doing wise aging for a couple of years now, few years. And I'm wondering whether the aged represents some sort of threat. One is that we represent what others have not yet experienced. And when we're young, we have to know it all. We have to pretend that we're on top of everything in every moment, that we've got all the answers. And to encounter someone with another answer is threatening.
Right.
And the fact that, at least for me and for many others, we become more curious and open as we get older. And that also is very threatening to those who are shut off and have to know everything. The other part is just something that you alluded to, which is this person may become a burden to me. They may want something of me. And I'm too preoccupied with my own little self in my own little world that I don't want anybody imposing anything on me. And I don't know if any or all of that is true, but it sure feels that way often. And the kindest thing a young woman said to me when I was tangoing one day was, she came up to me and she said, "I want to be you when I grow up." And I thought, whoa, hey, you're young and beautiful and tall and graceful, and you want to be me? Really? But I've been enjoying that ever since. So we'll see.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. Yeah. I like those points about, the notion of threat. I would add that to the list. Partially about, yes, you have more experience than I have, and that feels threatening. Partially might still be just, the threat of authority, that somebody 30 years old or 45 years old may still have a teenage mentality, that somebody older is like a principal or like a parent, someone who, is going to give them advice or give them rules or be, but then also your point around being more open-minded. I think there's a bad stereotype that seniors are rigid in their thinking, but I think you give a great counterpoint to that actually many who engage in adult learning or are actually some of the most curious and open-minded people of our society, and that someone in the ideological fervor of their 30s, 40s, or 50s or something might feel threatened by someone who's got a broader perspective. So yeah, thank you so much, Sarah, for all that. Okay, Lauren, back to you.
But the aging, I think it's something societal. I kind of see it as being part of being uber capitalistic, like you've got to have a purpose and you've got to be productive, and older people in society's eyes are not productive enough. Um, I felt I saw more concern from the elderly in Israel. Not that Israel isn't completely capitalistic now, but I felt that like maybe there was an ethnic thing. I worked in geriatrics, and I certainly saw among my patients, Chinese patients and Italian patients, their families were like so involved, and there was so much love, but also respect. And I think it's a societal thing. Maybe it's a WASP culture thing, but not. I don't believe all societies are as dismissive of the elderly. To be honest, it's even hard not to internalize it, because for me to be retired for a long time was very difficult. Like to feel I had a purpose and a use anymore. What am I if I'm not getting up every day, going to work and helping people? So that's just my take on
Thank you.
the aging thing. And thank you, Cheryl, for bringing it up.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Okay, so I'm going to read Gary Gartzman's great comment on the side, and then I'm going to conclude. I'll conclude our time today. But yeah, so he writes over here, radical alterity. Again, alterity means otherness. Levinas emphasized the radical otherness of the other, emphasizing that the other is not an object to be understood or assimilated, but a unique, irreducible presence. This alterity disrupts our self-centeredness and calls us to transcend our egoism. Thank you, Gary. I think that's such a great place to end today. So oftentimes when we meet people, we immediately want that commonality. We immediately want to feel that we're the same. But to disrupt that self-centeredness and actually find the uniqueness of the other and the difference and the dignity of that difference, again, on another book, feels so important for our time. And such a great challenge. And then, at the end of Les Mis, that famous line, to love another person is to see the face of God. What does it mean for us to see the face of another in its fullness, and to almost get out of ourselves to do that? What an amazing spiritual exercise for us to think about participating in today, in some encounter we're going to have today, of how to truly see somebody in some sense. Friends, thank you for joining, and looking forward. Thanks for that note over there, Alex, about scheduling, and look forward to seeing y'all next Thursday.